All right, we are moving now on to chapter 6, science. Science! Um,
The science.
the science. Yeah, that is a very significant distinction these days. Um, that is even a part of our opening quote here. We are shining the light of science on this invisible killer, which would be COVID. We will be driven by the science from Boris Johnson in 2020. 2020 and 2021 were filled with references to the science, as though that were a capital T, the, and a capital S, science. And that became kind of just a ubiquitous phrase. It's been used in the past, but I would say it really became a very common and repeated phrase right around that time.
Science.
The referring to science as a entity, or again, the science, meaning with the definite article that there is a singular voice, perhaps. And I think we would all understand many reasons why that would be the case in a time of pandemic, in a time of great mystery and crisis and death. And all of us here were touched very deeply and profoundly through COVID. All of us lost somebody important to us. All of us had our lives interrupted and for quite some time, very, very deliberately changed. I mean, it was very profound, the difference in being locked down or staying home or whatever it was. And stuff changed all the time. We probably remember that every few months there would be a new set of guidelines or rules. And sometimes those guidelines or rules didn't seem to go in line with what had gone on before. There were times where the guidelines or rules sometimes didn't seem necessarily coherent in their application. There were decisions made, for instance, about during the time of the shutdown in particular, what is an essential worker? What is an essential job? What is an essential industry? So that in order to stop the spread of the disease and affect those who are most vulnerable, certain places were closed down and you were not allowed to have public operation, and other places were because they were deemed to be necessary and worth the risk. Some of these seemed very obvious. We need people to be able to work in the utilities department of every county so that there's water and power and stuff like that. We relied on elements throughout the supply chain for food and for gasoline and for power supply and stuff like that. But after you got past the first handful of things that pretty much everybody would agree, well, yeah, how do we keep going without these certain functions? Then you started getting into stuff that seemed a little debatable. One of the classic complaints, that it was not so much an issue in the state of Florida, but it was in other states. Why is it that churches are closed, but liquor stores are open? Or this was another big one. And this did happen. This happened in Polk County, the state of Florida. This happened in Polk County. County parks were closed. So like a walking trail outside around the lake closed. And it's closed to stop the spread of a disease, which they basically found out was exceptionally difficult, if not impossible, to spread outside, being a respiratory disease. But being in the sunshine, vitamin D seemed to be particularly helpful. And just the exercise, which is good and necessary for you. And frankly, the stronger you are, the more likely you would be able to resist the worst effects. And so there were a lot of debates and how did you make the decision about what was essential? And even to the degree that people were in broad agreement that, I remember when what was it, 2 weeks or 10 days, whatever it was, when we first shut down in March of 2020, It was the second Sunday. It was the week of the second Sunday in Lent.
Yep.
And I forget what it was. It was a very brief period of time to start off with. It was very concrete. And the idea was, okay, well, we'll be back before Easter.
Yep.
Well, and the shutdown just kind of kept on going. So as it kept going, there was a decision, well, why? Should it go longer? Should it be shorter? When we were allowed to go places, we were all wearing masks, and then, there was sanitizing everywhere. Perhaps you were going to get your temperature scanned before you walked into a building, or you were, only so many people per, could come in at a time. When we were finally allowed to open up in church, we could only have X number of people in a building at any time. You had to be a certain distance apart. That's what we were running 3 services to both buildings, because if anyone who had been in that service, we found out later in the week, had contracted COVID, everyone in that service had to be contacted personally, said, don't show up next week, you have to quarantine, and then that whole building had to be sterilized. And so Rob and I were in different buildings on purpose.
Yeah.
Because if somebody got sick in that service, that priest was done for the next week. So to try to mitigate that risk, it was like, what is the president and vice president are never on the same flight at the same time, kind of thing. So anyway, we can look back to some of those things with a little bit more humor than we could at the time, maybe, because it was scary. And then it was frustrating. And sometimes it was infuriating.
Well,
This is the trouble, though, and it's inherent within this chapter. The science, first of all, is a terrible reduction of the concept of science, which is, in essence, a method, and it's collaborative and it's continuous. Science never speaks definitively on anything. Science simply promotes the best current understanding with the implicit assumption that understanding may be tested and proven false at any time. It ought to be tested. That's the way it works. Now, but here's the deal. What was the scientific method brought to bear choosing between a liquor store and a gym about which is open and which is closed? Is that a scientific question? And the answer is obviously not. That's a public health issue. That's a political issue. That's a philosophical issue. That's all these other things wrapped up together. It wasn't a bunch of scientists in lab coats, mixing things in test tubes and running spectrometers and getting a result that said liquor stores are good and gyms are bad. This was taking information to whatever degree it was procured, and then people thinking and choosing. And that's not a scientific process. Again, that is a philosophical process. That's a matter of public health. That's a political process, whatever it might be. I'm not denigrating the process so much as I am just trying to distinguish between the two. This is at the heart of the fundamental contemporary misunderstanding of science. And I say this as somebody who not only has a great appreciation for science and the scientific method. Remember, I'm the guy who does the science rotation of VBS every year because I get to blow things up and burn them down. That science as a tool, as a technique, as an area of knowledge is observational and descriptive. It's not proscriptive. It can't tell you anything. All it does is give you information. Information that then you have some other manner in which to weigh and choose and decide and apply. Science can tell you how something works. Science can never explain why something is. That's why science and philosophy require each other to work best for the understanding of humanity and the meaning of life. Science can tell us nothing about the meaning of things. It can only describe them so that we can understand its components, its processes, its effects. But the why, the ifs, the how comes, the now what's, that's outside of the realm of science. And it's not that science is bad at doing it. Those are not the questions science is designed to ask, to answer. That's a different way of operating. So it is, we could call it an epistemological system, a system of understanding and organizing and seeking truth. But the idea is it is only intended and it's only fit for certain types of knowledge, not every kind of knowledge. Science can explain a biochemical process that is happening within our brain, the electrical impulses, the hormonal secretions, the which synapses and which part of the brain, can scan on an MRI and see which parts are lighting up or whatever under a certain condition. But science cannot describe love. It can't explain love. It can give no meaning to love or freedom or happiness or justice or contentment or purpose or meaning or all sorts of stuff that we would say that's very important in life. That helps make life life. It helps make humanity human. For science is ultimately it's a material process, looking at matter, stuff. And it is not intended, nor is it useful for asking questions about purpose or meaning.
Just do it.
Well, it can describe what happens when you do something, but it can't say why you do it, or if what you did was right or wrong, or if what you did was even useful or not. Science, in a nutshell, can explain the observations of the universe, but it can never explain why there is a universe in the first place. So this is what we get to quite a bit within this chapter, the where science comes from, especially our current concept, the scientific method, and how it has become sort of misunderstood, most especially in its relationship to faith. And that seems to be a function of the last couple of 100 years. That is a late Enlightenment distinction that an early Renaissance, early scientific period would not have made much sense. As a matter of fact, theology was once considered the queen of sciences. If science is simply observing the world and trying to understand it, theology is our, human sense of understanding God and his nature and the world and everything else. And they used to go kind of hand in hand. As a matter of fact, especially the English scientists of the 16 and 1700s, so this is, late Renaissance into the Enlightenment, these are like the super famous names, were almost invariably also clergy. Yeah, because they were working in a university for the most part to do their teaching and their research. And who ran the universities? The church did. We talked about that last chapter. The whole concept of the university comes from the church. And it doesn't separate out from the church until basically mid-late 1800s. The motto of Harvard University is Veritas, truth. Well, it used to be Veritas in Christos, truth in Christ, because Harvard was founded as a seminary. Now, a seminary to train clergy had a very expansive, very, very comprehensive understanding of how clergy could be trained. And that meant people could also be trained in the law, people could be trained in the sciences, people could be trained in medicine, all these various things. But its purpose was to glorify God through the pursuit of knowledge, which is a classical understanding of the university as a whole. So university, in that sense, the unity is all of these various fields and disciplines of knowledge united. Why? The pursuit of truth, for that in and of itself glorified God, from whom all truth flows. This is the heart of the scientific method. This is how someone like Francis Bacon is coming up with the rules and even just the philosophy underpinning the concept of experiment, observation, hypothesis, and all this kind of stuff together, because the biblical vision of the world is one that is understandable, it is sensible, and it is orderly, for it has been not randomly accumulated, but purposefully created. And we are both a part of that creation, but we are also blessed and gifted within that creation in the image of the Creator. And a part of that is being able to understand. Now, this is a philosophical issue, but this is where science has nothing to say, because it has to stand on this ground. It has nowhere else where it could stand. And that is the positing of something beyond the material. There must be something beyond just the observable material in whatever way we might observe it. But, the materialist says all that there is what we can see or touch or observe in some fashion. It's the atoms, it's the molecules, it's the subatomic components, it's the waves, it's the particles, all these that's all that there is. There is nothing beyond matter, beyond stuff. There's no spirit, there's no soul, there's no God. All this stuff is, it's fanciful, and we ignore it because it's only the material. Problem with that is, how do you know? How do you know that the material is all that there is? Well, it's actually a deeper question than you might think. It almost sounds smart alecky, but it's even deeper than you can take it on the surface, which is without some sort of philosophy, the science itself makes no sense. That how do you know there is no supernatural world, or there's only the material? Because that in and of itself is a non-scientific observation. You can't test it, you can't prove it, you can't measure it. So how do you know? You can't prove a negative scientifically. How do you know? But it's deeper than that. It's even deeper than that, and that's because of this. Why in the world, if we were the random accumulation of particles and waves that has evolved over however long to, brains and eyes, why would we believe that what our senses perceive and what our brain interprets is reliable at all to what is real? It is, after all, a random occurrence. It is, after all, a purposeless collection of these atoms and molecules and subatomic particles and everything else. Why would such things have any reliable insight into the world at all?
Repetition.
How do you know? How do you know it's repeating? If your eyes and brains are just evolved randomly, why would you believe that what you see and what you think has any correspondence to the outside world? You have no idea. There's no basis for believing that. Again, even the language we use, believe. This philosophers have wrestled with this for millennia. This is when Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," he is basically making a philosophical statement about not just the nature of identity, but that this world is a sensible world because I am able to think. And my act of thinking marks me as an individual and as a person and as a life. He posits at one point, he suggests, how would we know, and this happened hundreds of years ago, how would we know that what we perceive around us is actually real and not some kind of simulation? Now, he called it, what if a demon was guiding us into believing that what we saw was real, but it was actually false? But it's almost like the Matrix. This is, Descartes talking about this a couple hundred years ago. Just the fact that we can see things and touch things. You've never had a dream that seems so real that you could feel things, hear things, see things. How do you know if we start cracking that one open about what's actually real, if you are only allowed to use material explanations, you can only go back to the atoms and the subatomic particles and the waves. There is no consistent and rational reason to believe anything that we believe at all. There's no reason to think that's reliable. Our senses may or may not be telling us the truth. How do you know? No idea. Our brains may or may not be interpreting correctly. How do we know? No idea. So again, this is where science is not set in opposition of faith. It grows from it. Here's a Middle Ages quote that I used last week from St. Anselm. Fides quorens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. That we start with the act of faith, and then as we believe, we are able to learn and to know more. He was applying it as a theological statement. We will only know so much about God until we believe. Once we do, we can actually encounter and experience more. And he relates it to love and marriage. You may know something of love and something of marriage, but it's only once you engage in it that you actually truly learn what it is. I would tell that to couples in premarital counseling. You can read every book you want, but it's not the same thing as doing it. So faith-seeking understanding is at the origin of the scientific method. Faith that our world has been created in purpose and by purpose, and that world is organized, and that our ability to observe it, to consider it, to interact with it, and to think about it is reliable. Those are positions not of science. Science cannot tell us any of that. Those are philosophical positions of faith. But once we believe that, well, then we can do something with it. Now, why am I connecting that to the origin of the scientific method? Well, at the heart, the scientific method is about experimentation and observation. Okay, so this is we're going to test the theory of gravity, and I'm going to take the two objects and I'm going to drop them, and one's a feather and one's a brick, and they're going to hit the ground at the same time, and that stuff that you've done, in a classroom or whatever it might be. But it could be anything that we have an experience and therefore a reason to believe in some sort of cause and effect relationship. Okay, anything at all. Once we have seen and established a pattern, this experiment results in this conclusion. We believe that to be reliable information. If you take vinegar and baking soda and you mix it together, what's going to happen? They're going to interact, and it's going to release carbon dioxide as the acetic acid so what happens though if you live in a world where the rules are changeable, where you mix them together and instead of bubbling up with carbon dioxide, they turn yellow, or it gets hot, or nothing happens at all. We believe that 2 + 2 = 4 every single time. But what if there were no laws of nature? It was all kind of continually up for grabs. And tomorrow 2 + 2 might equal 5. That would make a huge difference, not just for kids learning math. Every computer system that operates in every vehicle and object that we own would be completely unworkable because the algorithms inside would lead to different results every time they ran. We trust that the rules of nature are not going to suddenly reverse on us. That if Isaac Newton drops the apple, at no time will it shoot up in the air. And like, oh, 1 out of 100 times, you never know. Like, no, once we have observed a rule sufficiently to describe it and understand it, we trust that that is actually something that is a reliable result. So you trust the reliability of the observation, you trust the reliability of the sensibility of what's around us, and the rules of creation itself. But that's not a given. That's not a given. This is, I'm not trying to make a political statement. This is just descriptive. Arabic societies in the Middle East went through a period, especially in the early Middle Ages, of kind of outpacing the West in their growth of knowledge and scientific achievement. This is where algebra comes from, and even the number system that we use, that is an Arabic script. All sorts of things have been attributed, but then they hit about the 8th or 9th century, and it kind of just freezes. And you don't really hear about innovation. You don't really hear about the pinnacles of human knowledge from that part of the country. I mean, from that part of the world. It really shifts to other places. And even today, we don't really think of places like, Qatar or Iraq or Yemen as being centers of the highest learning. Why? One of the suggestions in world history is the nature of Islam. So where those Arabic cultures and societies, the pre-Islamic cultures, were flourishing in their pursuit of knowledge, within just a few generations of Islam, this is happening in the 700s, within less than 200 years, it's so shaped the culture that some scientific pursuits or some pursuits of knowledge were seen as unfaithful because you just needed to take it on trust. By trying to explore and describe, you were acting unfaithfully to Allah, who, as we read about Aristotle's description, things simply were what they were. There was no need to experiment. He talked, if the planets move in a circle, it's because the circle is the perfect shape, and it just is what it is. Well, and that was a part of the culture that said that Allah, the ways of Allah were so beyond us. What we have to do is submit. That is what Islam means. It means submission. We humbly submit to the will of Allah, who, again, we can talk about the ways of God are above and beyond us, but especially through his work in Scripture and in the incarnation, this is the infinitude of God coming down to humanity. That does not happen in Islam. So Allah is so separated out from his people, and the holiness and the difference is so extreme the way that they describe the world being created, it is what it is. And you're playing with fire if you want to dig around too much. It's what are you trying? Are you trying to disprove Allah's word? Are you trying to show that you're better or smarter? Because you aren't. So you're unfaithful by doing that. So it really kind of put a damper on what had been a very exploratory culture and one that had, places of great learning and libraries and thought and all this kind of stuff. We were philosophers, they were inventors. And so there we went through, what was several hundred years of kind of discouraging it. I'm not going to say it forbid it, but there was a very definite sense of don't even try to describe the laws of nature because that is presumptuous. Allah will do what Allah will do. And that's all there is to it. You just need to accept it.
Was this I know the word isn't right, phrases?
The clergy, it's kind of there in the Quran, but as it is developing into not just a theological system, but as it's developing into a governmental system and a cultural system. So remember that Islam it's not just a faith, it's also in many ways it's a culture, and in many ways it's a system of laws, it's a system of governance, it's a system of ordering human affairs. So anyway, that was not the position of the church. The position of the church was, we've been made in the image of God. God has even honored us through the incarnation, and our humanity from the beginning was created in the image of God, given dominion over the earth, but honored through the incarnation, even in the material, even in the flesh. So as broken as the world and our flesh and the material world may be, God's not done with it. He doesn't hate it. And we are still able to understand. As a matter of fact, we're encouraged. What's the greatest law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands, saying all the law and the prophets. That's what Jesus says. That is the summary of the law. When the law begins and Moses brings it down, it begins Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. From the beginning, we were encouraged to use our intellect and to think and to look and to try to make sense of stuff, that it was somehow honoring to God when we did that. Trying to understand actually honors God. Thinking through stuff is using what we have been given, how we've been created. So the concept of the scientific method takes a few things for granted because of our faith. Again, that the world is sensible. We are able to understand something. We're able to observe. Our observations are meaningful. But that this creator is trustworthy and orderly. The world is not topsy-turvy. The world is not constantly being remade at God's whim, but instead, as God has created, things are kept in place with his order. The whole concept of the natural law, meaning both morally and physically, the world reflects a sensibility, an order, and a rightness that reflects the character of God. And God has encouraged us to learn and to know and to draw closer. Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. There is no Christian truth and scientific truth. There's just truth. It's either true or it's not. But because Christ is the truth, God himself is one who has ordered and ordained all of this. All truth is God's truth. It belongs to him. Whether it's a statement of faith, on the third day he was risen, or it's a statement of observable mathematics, that 2 + 1 = 1 + 2. If it's true, it reflects something of the nature of God. We're not being unfaithful when we search for truth. The one who said, "I'm the way and the truth and life," said, "Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you." The endeavor of using our minds to glorify God by trying to understand the world that he had placed us in and what this all means grows into the scientific method. So this is very, very connected to last week when we were talking about the Middle Ages as not being some kind of dark break in between antiquity with its ancient wisdom and the Renaissance with its rebirth and enlightenment. And then you have this like big gap in the middle where it's just all scary and blah. But no, it's more of a continuous thing. The Middle Ages were where a lot of these ideas are first planted, or they're, even if they've been planted before, they're watered and they're nurtured so that they could bloom and fruit within the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. There's no like, the Middle Ages are, we should just skip over that. Gosh, what? I forget the election. So yeah, if you're watching this, we just had election results from the presidential election last night. And it just made me think that it was within my lifetime. This was, I don't know how many elections ago, but the term was coined flyover country, because there was like the coasts voted blue Democrat and the middle of the country voted red Republican, and they would show these maps and they started talking about flyover country, that, you know, all those kind of poor benighted people in the middle, but then the urbane sophisticated people on the coasts, and you could just kind of fly over them. You could fly over the rubes. And the problem is, regardless of your political persuasion, why in the world would you assume that half of your country should just be skipped over? You know, if only for the fact that everyone of every political persuasion is in the middle too. Like the people you agree with are there as well. Like, I mean, the Middle Ages were not flyover country historically. They were, he even describes it as more of an evolutionary process. The monks, the monastics, the early thinkers who would one day grow into what we would consider to be scientists. We can kind of scoff at the concept of alchemy. Remember the people trying to turn lead into gold? Yep. We've got a very, very, almost an unfairly brief summary of the goal of alchemy. There were some elements of alchemy which were kind of proto-chemical, like the stuff that they were doing and making their tinctures and mixtures and stuff like that would eventually become more codified and more rigorous and become what we would consider the beginnings of modern chemistry. But they were seeing the material world and the spiritual world together. The process for turning lead to gold was a material process, but it was also a spiritual process of turning our broken humanity into who God intended us to be. Because they saw it all as kind of a continuous, connected whole. And there's actually something quite beautiful about that. Now, just because eventually it breaks off and specializes so it can make more sense of stuff, it doesn't mean that chemistry just kind of popped up out of the ground out of nowhere. You can look what the alchemists did and say, well, that's where they were wrong. But if they had not been wrong, if they'd done nothing at all, we wouldn't have what we have. It was in their process of trying and thinking and working on stuff. And even if they had it upside down and backwards, if they hadn't tried and thought about stuff, we would not have what we have today. Anybody have any thoughts about the Galileo example that he gave? Because that's a story that we tend to get like a one sentence, heroic Galileo standing against the self-righteousness of the church. But his chapter, it only took like a page, but it did kind of a nice explanation of showing it was a little more complicated than everybody seems to assume. Any thoughts about that one?
No, I just remember agreeing with that kind of overall concept of, once again, commercial church is wrong.
Hmm.
I, I, I don't have a great fondness for popes and cardinals and
You know, it's, and,
et
and,
cetera.
and it's a fair point that the church made a mistake in what they did and how they did it. And that is not something to be glossed over. What gets so lost in the quick kind of mythical retelling these days is that somehow Galileo was being condemned because he was preaching against scripture, which is not how they made their decision or what the decision was based on. Instead, they did kind of what we would have probably tried to do in that age. They asked, what does the science say? All the other great thinkers of the day, what's your vote? This was, 4 out of 5 dentists agree. This is what sometimes the scientific consensus says.
Right?
So all of the other great thinkers said, no, Galileo's wrong. Now, as it turns out, he was wrong. Part of it was right. The Copernican model at its heart was right about the heliocentrism, the sun being in the middle, but everything else about it was mistaken. But that's science. That's science where you formulate, postulate, test, and then you correct. And that model then allowed it to be tested, refined, and it's better, more accurate, more useful than it used to be, because from their ability to understand, they came up with their best understanding possible. It just so happens that it was mostly wrong, a little more right than it used to be. And then the idea is more work on it, and more people think about it, more experiments happen, and we refine that model and it gets better and better and better. That's a sort of scientific process that was kind of happening behind the scenes during the pandemic. It's just the people reporting on it tended to continually act as though it was always a settled decision. Now, behind the scenes, people were working on this and they were figuring stuff. Oh, we thought it was this, but now we see it's that. But because the stakes are so high, as soon as we get any kind of new information, we're putting it out there because this is literal life and death for certain people. Well, the problem is, did you fully understand that? No, but sometimes it's worth acting quickly, and the delay to make sure it's completely correct is riskier than something that's mostly correct. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes mostly correct and completely correct are actually pretty far apart, and the consequences are pretty real. But again, making that decision, how correct do we need to be to get this information out to people? Not a scientific question at all. That's a philosophical question. That's a psychological question. That's a political question. See what I mean? So again, the science. What the church did was take sides, and it sided with the science. But that should have been a lesson that we still take heed from. There is no such thing as the science. It doesn't matter if 9 out of 10 scientists say one thing, because it has nothing to do with a democratic vote. It has to do with what's accurate, what's true. And it only takes one person to get it right. And they're right. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that everybody else assumes or thinks or, has it formulated in a different way. There are literally countless. I'm not sure how you could even count the number of times where you have like the singular scientist who has to push up against his colleagues to say, no, it's actually this. And sometimes there's these really massive consequences for it. The one, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He has a very, very simple, common sounding name. John Snow. John Snow, this is a huge one. This was in like the 1800s, and I think it was in London. and they kept having these cholera outbreaks throughout the city. And the consensus at the time had to do with what was causing it. And John Snow started investigating the wells. He was looking at where these outbreaks happen and how they spread, and he worked backwards, and he was able to identify a particular city well that people were drawing water from. And when he investigated further, it was like a dead goat or something. There was some decaying matter that was causing this bacterium to spread. But he was shunned for his ideas. But just because he was shunned, or just because 4 out of 5 dentists agree, he was still right.
Yeah.
That's science. And again, this is not in opposition to faith. Faith and science are not just friends, they're family. They are one. If they don't depend on one another, science absolutely depends on faith, because without faith, science would have never happened. Science cannot survive or operate on its own. It must have philosophy around it. Otherwise, we're just left with descriptions of things. Descriptions without application or without any sense of interpretation have no meaning. If I just gave you a series of numbers, who cares? It doesn't mean anything. But if I said, oh, that's my phone number, please call me. Well, now I've added meaning to numbers. If I've said, that's my credit card information, feel free to buy what you'd like. That means something, right? But that requires something outside of the strict material, something outside of the observational use of our senses, of the measurable, of the experimental. It takes something beyond science to confer meaning to its own observations. We cannot interpret, we cannot apply, we cannot advance, we cannot grow unless that science is interpreted and applied. Unless we see what is meaningful and understand what meaning is. And then we make choices on competing goods, perhaps. You know, these experimental results kind of go in 2 directions, but we can only pick one, or we can only fund one. Or these are the results if we go in this direction, and we might learn something, but we will have to murder 30,000 kittens. How do you make that decision to say, let's go with option A, the non-kitten murdering option? That's not a scientific question or answer. That's a moral question. That's a philosophical question. It is an existential question. It is a theological question. It is a question of faith. So the church and science should be great friends. They are family. They're blood related after all, because all truth is God's truth. I remember sitting in a lecture. This is at UF. This was a national ministry called the Veritas Forum, which sought to bring Christian speakers who were also academics in a university field to other colleges, so that students and professors could come and encounter them, hear them, and interact, ask questions, stuff. He's a theoretical physicist and a cosmologist from, I think, somewhere in the University of California system, Hugh Ross. And he was a deeply faithful Christian. And he gave this presentation on how as a theoretical physicist and a cosmologist, that is someone who studies the scientific origin and nature of the universe. You know, how big is the universe? What's its shape? Is it expanding? Is it contracting? Well, that's cosmology. And Hugh Ross said, as I read the first chapter of Genesis, what struck me was the order that things happen in. You know, that it happens in a specific order. Let there be light, and then we start. Every moment of creation has this kind of specific order about what happens next. He said, as far as the origins of the universe is concerned, that's not the order I would put it in, unless I was standing in the position of the earth. If I could do that at the time of the Big Bang, that's the order from my point of view that I would see things occur. And I remember thinking, like, I've never heard such a thing. I had no idea. I thought that, you read Genesis 1 and you either take it in faith or you say, no, science explains it differently. And he had this very fascinating, as an expert in the field, this very fascinating perspective that no, they actually fit together better than you think they do. They just don't fit together from the center of the universe. They fit together because we're not in the center of the universe. But it does fit together from, if you could like stand in space at the place where the earth would eventually be, this is the order that you would experience the moments of creation as related to in Genesis. I'm like, really? I've never heard that before in my life. But I thought it was very interesting. There was a period of time, and I'm old enough to remember when I was young, that we were still kind of feeling the vestiges of this. That the Big Bang was kind of an anti-Christian concept for some reason. It kind of felt like how Christians weren't supposed to like Harry Potter when it first came out. Because there was a certain strain of Christianity that said, oh, it's witchcraft and it's bad. Like, did you ever read the books? They're actually very, very moral. And she was a member of the Church of Scotland. And there's a lot of this that teaches pretty well. But I remember, like, this is like early 80s. You were supposed to reject the Big Bang because it was kind of anti-Christian. The Big Bang was formulated by a Catholic priest. Did you know that? That gets so lost in the shuffle because it not only follows the best science of the time, and so far, we learn more, we refine it, but it's still a model that is used today, formulated by a Catholic priest because he was convinced that this fit creation ex nihilo, the description of God creating out of nothing. Because that's how scripture begins. In the beginning, God.
Yeah.
That's it. Nothing else. And then God speaks into creation and it all happens.
Mm-hmm.
Out of nothing, let there be light, like a Big Bang. And that's where it comes from. Not as an anti-Christian, how can we explain the origins of the universe by removing God? Oh, no. It was actually intended to harmonize and synthesize the two. If I believe that in the beginning God, and I observe these are the elements of the beginning of creation to the best of our ability to understand and apply right now, they actually, they fit together, and I don't know why they got lost, but there was a period of time, maybe a couple, 3 decades, I'm not sure, but there was a period of time where it seemed to be in opposition, but it never was, and it still isn't. I am wholly and completely convinced of that. You know why? Because all truth is God's truth. Mm-hmm. And if something comes and disproves the Big Bang theory, because that's what it is, in theory, we get better scientific tools, we have new mathematical models or whatever, and it gives us some other better representation about the, scientific origins of the universe or the solar system or whatever it is, well, then that'll be God's truth too, And we just have a better understanding than we did before. And we are actually encouraged to use our minds and our brains and to keep thinking, keep exploring, keep trying to understand, keep using science. It's a God-given tool, a blessed and holy thing to be able to look around the world and make sense of it. What a gift. These things are not in opposition to each other at all.
Why are so many professors, though, anti God.
A fine question. I don't know that it has a particularly knowable answer. I will say that since the 1800s, that there has been almost a purposeful sense of separating the two out. So both through the Enlightenment saying, as we are growing and learning and understanding, we needed that has to be in opposition to something. So what is it in opposition to? It must be in opposition to where we came from before. Because if it's new and improved, we talked about this last week. If it's new and improved, then that means what came before is old and it is inferior. It's out of date. It's whatever. Well, so what was that? Well, that must be the church, because we can look at world history. We can see the church. We can see problems that happened in Christian Europe and the wars between the different countries and the Crusades and blah, blah, blah. So it starts being sort of promoted with this is new and improved, and it's over against what it used to be. And then there was another sect, and this comes from the church side. Oh, yeah. The rise of fundamentalism is a reaction to that by saying, oh, you're moving too fast and I don't understand. I'm going to dig my heels in even harder. And you're going to accuse me of being backwards. I'm going to accuse you of being a heretic. And now, brothers have turned their backs on each other, and they're, and it's, how do you fix that? And then I hope you haven't seen this in your family, but it definitely happens. I come from a grudge holding people. Imagine a family where two brothers have some kind of falling out, even if everybody else knows that there shouldn't be. Maybe it's a big misunderstanding, whatever it is, but they have and then they're so stubborn, they're so set in their ways that they start formulating a life in opposition to each other. What happens when they have children? Are those cousins going to be good friends?
No.
Because all they heard their entire life is that side of the family are dirty old so-and-sos and they're out to get you. It's the Hatfield and McCoys or whatever. And then the next generation, they're taught the same thing. That's the air they breathe. And the next generation, and they just further separate out. So I think there's a practical sense at some level of that. Academia has grown away from faith. And at some point, I think that was a fixable problem. But it's been taught generationally now. So now it's just obvious. Like, you couldn't possibly say something good about that side of the family. We've known for 1,000,000 years that they're terrible. As a matter of fact, if you start to have sympathy with them, are you really on our side at all? Oh, no. No, my bad. That, slip of the tongue. Yep, they're the worst. And it becomes very insular. It becomes very self-fulfilling. And now that system, and it can be on the side of the church too. We have whole swaths of the church that says, universities are a tool of the devil. Don't send your kids because they're just going to get brainwashed. Oh, okay, but then who's going to be my doctor in 20 years? Who's going to build bridges in 20 years? Some university training is really useful, and I would like a well-trained surgeon one day. I want my roads to be repaired by people who have studied how to build roads. I would like my airline pilots to be skilled in aeronautics, So there is a lot of almost cultural stubbornness to the point where it's just these are deeply held assumptions. They're really almost articles of faith on both sides. They are. On both sides. Which again, it's crazy on the scientific side, at least, because if you're going to say there's no such thing as faith, that's a statement of faith. There's no such thing as faith as a statement of faith. You have to believe that because there's no proof for that, right? There's no measurement. There's no experiment. It is in and of itself a statement of faith. It's self-contradictory, self-defeating. It's violating the law of non-contradiction in the same way. If I were to proclaim, I cannot speak a word of English as I spoke English, that logically it just doesn't follow. So anyway, this is it's an assumed position of our contemporary culture. The science and faith are opposites. We've got the light and the dark, and both sides can say that against each other. The church side says we are the light of Christ and they are the darkness of the world. And the academic side says we are the light of knowledge and flourishing and exploration and discovery and understanding, and they are the darkness of superstition. And the reality is both sides are just being stupid and petty and stubborn. And both sides are intended to work together because both sides should be using their God-given minds to pursue truth, because all truth is God's truth. I mean, I don't know how to say it otherwise. Jesus says, I am the truth. So all truth is God's truth. I have zero, I'll fight you on that one. I'll fight, because that's how well convinced I am. What else?
Okay.
All right, we feel good about science now? Science!
Bye,
I want us to love science because science is truly awesome. It really is. It's amazing. It's good. We benefit from it every single day, all the time. We ought to encourage people to explore and to learn, even to question. I'm not afraid of questions. Science is nothing but questions. This is how God has made us, to pursue him. And that's going to be in a philosophical and theological way, a relationship with God, but it also absolutely and positively can be using our God-given intellect to understand this world that he has made and that he has placed us in order to be a part of it. So, science, just not the science, because that's a whole different set of problems. Okay, we good?
Yeah,
All right. Thank you very much.
thank you.